Please hold while I confirm your passcode. Thank you for joining Global Meet. When you hear the tone, you will be the 16th person to join the meeting.
Now, to build up to our next chapter of our screening, brief intervention, and prevention work in juvenile justice settings, otherwise known as SBIRT. Some of the SBIRT pilot site folks are on the call right now, but we're going to spend an intensive year of study on the lessons that we've learned from that first chapter, the first 4 years of our work, and for what we hope will be another multi-year project with the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. So we're excited about that and very hopeful for what lies ahead on that. Also, I don't know if folks on the call are going down to Houston at the end of the month for the NADCP, the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, their big annual conference. It's a big, giant event every year. I think, 2,000, 2,500 attendees every year. I will be there taking part in 2 workshops, and it's kind of the informal, semi-official launch of the work that we're doing around the new guidelines for juvenile treatment courts. The technical assistance for helping sites around the country to kind of fine-tune their work in treatment courts and to consider and adopt elements of the new guidelines or the new guidelines themselves. The TA providers for that are American University and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and together with them, I'll be taking part in kind of an overview workshop of the technical assistance that's available to treatment courts around the country that you can request through the federal portal and get some support. And as most folks know, the piece of the technical assistance puzzle that Reclaiming Futures is responsible for is working with courts around equity and inclusion and racial and ethnic disparities in behavioral health decision-making in the courts. And so we'll be introducing that at the NADCP conference. It'll be the first time we've publicly spoken to that audience about the what's available to them nationally. And I would say I will turn it over to Emmett Hayes, who, as the faculty member at Reclaiming Futures, overseeing the project director fellowship. This is the scheduled time for his call, and he made the connection to Tashira, and I want to just pass the baton over to him to introduce Tashira and moderate the rest of the call.
Thank you, Evan. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are in America. I am so pleased that you all are able to join us this morning. We have a great presentation in store for us, and hopefully most of you have received the link, Fighting for Our Girls, giving you an opportunity to see some of the work that's being done by Tashira Halyard. Tashira is a member of the Center for the Study of Social Policies located in Washington, D.C. She's also leading that agency, the Alliance for Race, Equity, and Child Welfare. It's really good that we have Tashira presenting to us today because of some of the work that she's been involved in, which includes direct services with children and youth, children and families, as well as policy background. She's had some engagement and worked in education, homeless services, juvenile justice, child welfare. My goodness, she sounds like she's been working with us for all these years. She also currently is a member of the board of directors for DC's ACLU and serving as the equity officer. But what is really exciting right now is that she's working on developing an implicit racial bias curriculum for CPS workers and their supervisors, with the goal of mitigating bias on the frontline decision-making. That should really be another presentation for us in the future, but we're really excited to have her this morning because of the timeliness of this discussion. We are more and more aware of the proliferation of the issues and challenges of just being a woman or a girl in America. There are so many things we seem to have had a blind eye to, but now the awakening has begun or continues to begin, and we are really excited to hear from Tashira this morning. Tashira, are you there?
I am here. How's the sound, you all? I have you on speaker.
It's good.
I hear you just fine. I'm going to back out of the way and give it to you, girl. Go get it.
Thank you. Thank you for such an amazing introduction. As Annette mentioned, my name is Tashira Halyard. I'm a senior associate at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, where I lead the Alliance for Racial Equity and Child Welfare. The Alliance was created in 2003 with the goal of helping to improve outcomes of children and families of color who are involved in the nation's child welfare system. And so I'm so excited to be here with you all today because we don't have enough of these kinds of conversations. I'm not sure how it is for you all in your respective institutions and jurisdictions, but I know I don't get a chance often enough to talk across the lines to folks who are in juvenile justice systems. And that's a shame because we're talking so often about the same kids. And that's where the premise of Fight for Our Girls actually came from. So Fight for Our Girls is a social justice series that I started to write back in probably about the latter part of 2016, 2017 or so. It is a series of publications that are looking at girls of color who are involved in systems for status offense behaviors. And I don't want to assume everyone on the call is sitting in a system, so I'll talk a bit more about what those behaviors are. But our goal through the system, through the publication series, is to apply an intersectional lens. So to look at race and in this case, race and gender. So often when we talk about the issues that our young folks face, we tend to sit in the problem. We can inadvertently, even as advocates, I believe, pathologize them by only talking about the trauma and the negative experiences that they've had. And when getting started with this series, this quote guided me, and it's by poet, playwright, novelist Ntozake Shange in her novel Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. She says, what she wanted for her girls was more than that. She wanted happiness, however they could get it, whatever it was, whoever brought it. And so I know with you all in your work from public health lens and for me and my national policy lens, we talk a lot about what it means to be trauma-informed. And while happiness may not be a clinical term in that same way, just very simply, we want our young people to be happy and we want them to be whole. So before I get started, let me just say that at CSSP, we behold ourselves to an expansive view of what it means to be a girl. That means those who identify themselves as girls, whether you are transgender, cisgender, femme, gender non-binary, or two-spirit, we recognize youth preferred gender identity. However, for reasons that I'm sure we all are very familiar with, that is not oftentimes how our data are collected. So much of what I talk about today will be from a cisgender girl perspective, and I really would like to use this opportunity to call forward the need for greater research around our girls and also our boys who have an expanded view of what it means to be a girl or a boy. And CSSP has a project called our Get Real initiative that talks all about that, and I'm happy to share some resources with you all from Get Real as well. So first, let's talk about status offenses. So folks, I'm sure, know that these are behaviors like running away, violating curfew, missing school, not following the rules at home. And these behaviors can land you in the child welfare or the juvenile justice system. Now, I am a child welfare person. I've done some juvenile justice work, but I even was an attorney guardian ad litem coming out of law school for young people who are involved in the abuse and neglect system. But again, what we have recognized with CSSP is that we cannot just rest our analysis and our work in child welfare. We have to have a view of what's happening in juvenile justice as well. And status offenses is the perfect example of why that's necessary, because depending on the jurisdiction, a young person can find themselves in either system. And that actually complicates how much we know about status offenses, because child welfare does not collect this data as a separate abuse or neglect charge. The data that I'll be sharing are largely from the juvenile justice perspective, but I will posit to you all that the number of young people who are in secure facilities is greater than we even know because of the child welfare involvement that may be on the table, as well as their involvement in PINS or CHINS systems. So what do we know about the role of trauma in girls' lives? And I think it's important to start here, only because what so often happens is that we are criminalizing trauma. And I bring this up in fight for our girls, but also in the seminal report called the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, where some great organizations like Right for Our Girls actually do the work to map out a girl's trajectory in being system involved and how very often it goes from being traumatized and abused to being locked up for those behaviors that are a response to that trauma and abuse. So what we know is that 70% of girls in juvenile justice facilities have been sexually abused. We know that girls in foster care experience challenges that are beyond what we might consider to be typical, quote-unquote, adolescence, so abuse and neglect, unstable and dangerous environments, sexual victimization as well, interpersonal, even communal violence, inconsistent school attendance, and just overall unmet physical, developmental, and mental health needs. And again, status offenses can be a direct result of these challenges. For example, a young person who has had multiple foster care placements becoming disconnected from school, not having their educational needs met, may pick up a truancy charge. A young person who is being abused and victimized at home may pick up a running away charge. What happens when we look at the behavior out of context from the trauma that they have experienced? So we don't know nearly enough about this intersection of girls of color specifically in status offenses, besides in the juvenile justice arena, their rates of being locked up. But I'll share with you these statistics that I do think are important to contextualize the issue. We just have to maybe extrapolate a bit to understand the full picture of what's happening with girls of color specifically. First and foremost, girls are more likely to be arrested for status offenses. And I want to put a pin in that for 1 second because I talk about this in the paper, and for me it's huge because our early juvenile justice systems were founded upon sexist and patriarchal expectations of what was acceptable for girls versus boys. So, for example, early juvenile courts could pick up a girl for being out late, for cursing, for being in a saloon, for being alone. These were not charges that boys could be apprehended for. And to this day, when we think about the disparity in arrest rates for status offenses, some of those patriarchal values are still in play. We know that 40% of the girls make up 40% of young people placed in out-of-home placements for status offenses, although they're just 12% of the disposition overall. We know that the running away rate increased dramatically for Black youth versus white youth within a 10-year period, 1995 to 2006 specifically. In 2009, the ungovernability case rate for Black youth was more than twice the rate of white youth. And also, formally adjudicated, Black girls are 3 times more likely, Native American girls are 4 times more likely to be placed outside of their home as compared to their white counterparts. And that's the statistic, in my opinion, that should really be ringing bells across the country in every public system, because there is something happening here, especially with our Native American girls. And if there are folks on the call who work in with tribal communities, I would really love to connect with you, because in our research over the past 2 years, we have not found resources or research that could tell us why this high disparity rate exists. Now, we have our opinions about the role that bias plays in structural racism. However, we would love to hear from tribal communities themselves on this huge disparity that tribal girls face or indigenous girls face, especially compared to their white counterparts, and being placed in lock confinement for committing status offenses. So here's how girls talk about their interaction with public systems for these behaviors. This comes from a news report that was written by Salon last year. My biggest thing was not making my bed. That was considered a violation of probation. That I got locked up for it is ridiculous. And that may sound ridiculous to some of you. You might be thinking, did that really happen? Well, it can happen, and it happens very easily because while a young person cannot be locked up for a status offense per se, many courts do have the ability to use something called the valid court order exception. And that valid court order exception says that if a judge places you on probation for a status offending behavior and you violate it, you can then be locked up for that violation, so to speak. And so the charge ends up getting bootstrapped. So you're not necessarily locked up for running away, but for a violation that occurs because you ran away. It's a bit nonsensical, but that's how we've operated for some time. The new Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention Act has a limit on that exception. However, from my understanding, it has not been fully implemented yet. Another girl said, no one asked me if there could be something wrong, a reason for my acting out. And I think with this audience, that's something that probably resonates with you, given your focus on public health and behavioral health, because too often we ask our young people what's wrong with you versus what has happened to you. This was just a video that unfortunately will not be able to play for you all, but I usually share this in presentations because it's a video of Black girls in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they're talking about who they are. And they all start off by saying, I am a Black girl and each of them shares a very positive attribute. And at the end of the video, it's only about 2 minutes, I asked the audience, did anyone say, I'm a Black girl and I am loud? I'm a Black girl and I'm mean. I'm a Black girl and I'm promiscuous. I'm fast. No one said that. However, we tend to treat our young people, especially our girls of color, based upon these pathologized identities and that I talk about in the report that are a result of structural oppression and archetypal stereotypes, like the Jezebel, if you were Black, the Hottentot Venus, this hypersexualized version of a Black woman, like the Sapphire, the loud, finger wagging in your face, bad attitude stereotype. If you are Latina or Latinx, like the Sophia Vergara, this Latin bombshell stereotype. We treat our young people based upon the stereotypes that exist about them, not like they see themselves. And that would be an individual concern if it was not for the policies, practices, and procedures that become encoded with these implicit biases. So that leads me to then talk about biases, and we know that they can be both positive and negative. They are activated without our control. Many researchers and scientists who study mind sciences say that they are a result of a survival mechanism. When we see a snake, when we see a spider, we run the other way. We are biased, many of us, against spiders and against snakes. That's not a big concern. But when we see people of color, when we see women and those biases come into play, it becomes problematic. So that brings me to my point about intersectionality, because the Alliance existed in its foundation to improve outcomes for children and families of color. Our focus at that time was pretty singularly on race. But as we began to understand intersectionality, that broadened, and that brought us to fight for our girls. And so for folks who may not be familiar, intersectionality is a term that was coined by law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, where she says we have to look at overlapping identities as a unique and overlapping system of marginalization. So whether it be because of one's race, gender, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, immigration status, etc., none of these identities can be separated. They are inextricably linked, creating an inextricable form of bias and marginalization that many folks in our society face, including young people in our public systems. That goes back then to that stereotype of girls of color being loud, mean, promiscuous, and manipulative. Those stereotypes are there not just because of their race or their gender, it is a both-and conversation. And so what we're arguing for in Fight for Our Girls, that our responses to their behaviors also be both-and, that they are looking at gender and race at the very, very least. We also know, based upon the Georgetown Report that came out last year, some of you all may have seen that Black girls specifically are seen less innocent. And again, what policy recommendations or decisions, what practice recommendations or decisions are we making based upon these biases? We have to first recognize them to be able to mitigate them. And we also have research that shows for Black youth more generally, this is about boys and girls now, that probation officers view their negative behaviors as individual choices versus their white counterparts in this research report, who the professionals working with them, the probation officers, saw their behaviors as a result of familial and community dysfunction. So again, the Black kids were seen as making poor choices as a result of their own decision-making and negative behaviors, while the white kids were seen as making choices that were a result of family issues and community issues, not afforded the same level of consideration or innocence, going back to the Georgetown Report. This process so often see status offenses, and again, I used to be a guardian ad litem, and so I thought through these things myself. This is my way of not pointing fingers, but putting everything on the table and bringing the elephant in the room for us to have what oftentimes is a very difficult conversation, because when I go in front of rooms and I get presentations, folks often say, well, what do you want us to do? We need to lock girls up to keep them safe. Or they say, well, how can we prevent them from getting pregnant? Pregnancy is a huge concern. Or they say, I sit in a small rural county, and unless we place girls or young people more generally, unfortunately, into some sort of facility, we cannot get them the support and services they need. They have to go to congregate care or to juvenile detention to get services. Now, given the fact that you all in many ways have self-identified yourself as advocates that are working in this very progressive way, I'm sure that you all can find the nuances and ways to get around these things. However, it's not a conversation that very many people are having across the country. It still is very much, especially as it relates to girls, lock them up, throw away the key. They are a danger to themselves, and we have got to keep them safe. And the recommendation would be, how can we provide them with the support and the services that they need, either in-home if it's safe or in the community, to address these behaviors? Because once they are in the front door of our system, they only get deeper and deeper and deeper. I know you all are familiar with that, given the work that you do. However, I want to add child welfare into the conversation, because once they're in child welfare, the chance for them to become juvenile justice involved dramatically increases. So, talk a lot about the issues today. In this next part of my presentation, I just want to leave you all with ideas about how we can address this issue. And this comes from our Youth Thrive program at CSSP. If folks are interested, please reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation with you about Youth Thrive. There are also a bunch of resources on our website, and that is around the 5 protective and promotive factors. I won't get deep into all of these, but the idea is to protect healthy development and to increase well-being. This is for all youth now. We need to be investing in their resiliency, social connections, concrete support in times of need, knowledge of youth development, and also cognitive, social, and emotional competence. That is how we can get at addressing those status offending behaviors. Because we know adolescence is a period of profound brain development. In fact, Lawrence Steinberg says adolescence is the new 0 to 3. And 2 things are happening with our limbic system and our prefrontal cortex at that time. Our limbic system is having rapid changes. Emotionality and mood control is where that rests in our limbic system, reward and pleasure seeking. So it's natural to be pushing boundaries in adolescence. While on the flip side, there are very gradual changes happening to our prefrontal cortex. That is the control of our impulses, organization and planning, setting priorities, self-control and regulation, appropriate behavior. Those are moving much, much more gradually. So it kind of looks like this. Our limbic system is the rabbit, while our prefrontal cortex and all of our executive functioning is the turtle. This is what is happening in our young people's brains. And I think if we look at it from this perspective, it helps us to understand their behaviors and be a lot slower to pathologize them and to criminalize the behaviors. Also, we know, again, I talked about trauma earlier in this presentation, about what strong, frequent, and prolonged adversity without adult support does to the developing brain. It actually disrupts brain development. It increases the risk of psychopathology and physical illness. It can result in problems with trust, autonomy, and initiative, and it inhibits independence, intimacy, and self-care. Now, the good news is that the impact of trauma, toxic stress, these things are not permanent. Again, adolescent development is a new 0 to 3. We understand that brains are very malleable at that time. It is, however, a high need to work with young people during this time period who have experienced these things for us to have a holistic approach to their development and to their well-being. Again, harkening back to those protective and promotive factors from You Thrive is what I would encourage you all to look at closely. Because if we help to establish those brain connections that can be rewired with positive relationships, education, and support, then we can ensure positive youth development and well-being without having to lock girls of color up and throw away the key. Youth are not at the mercy of their risk factors. They're not at the mercy of their truant behaviors, their running away, their ungovernability charge. They can and they do change with the right type of support. So supportive adults, caring institutions, and opportunities for productive decision-making is key here. And I will stop there for questions and answers.
Well, Emmett is unmuting, which I think he probably is. I want to thank you, Tashira. That was awesome. You really are, your message is such a rational message of hope, and it really lines up, even though we don't know each other until now, as personally and as an organization, your thinking and your work really lines up very nicely with Reclaiming Futures work. So thank you so much for that presentation. And I'll step out of the way for folks who may have questions.
Yeah, that's right. I discovered I have another mute button on my phone, and I guess I muted everything. But Tashira, I too thank you very much for that. But you used the term a while back that I wanted you to maybe elaborate a bit on. You used the term bootstrap and offense.
Yes, so charges can be bootstrapped. And again, this will change in some circumstances as the DPA, the reauthorized bill, becomes implemented. But that legislation is very, very new. And still in courts around the country, the ones that use the valid court order exception, Kentucky is one of the biggest users from my understanding. If a young person, let's say, is truant, if they are missing school, well, what happens is they continue to miss school, then they will have, and the judge has told them, go to school. Then they can be then locked up, not for their original truancy charge, but for failing to go to school. It's kind of hard to explain because ultimately you're still criminalizing them for not going to school, but we call it bootstrapping very often. It's that it's not the initial offense that landed you in a secure facility. It is a bootstrap charge that happened after you came to the court attention and you were placed on probation. And it might be something as simple as not listening to your grandparents, missing curfew, violating some rule that in other ways it may be relatively benign, but because you are now court involved, that other infraction gets bootstrapped with your initial charge.
Mm-hmm. Good.
So this is how we say that that first instance of becoming system involved is so important because if we are not careful, young people can go further and further down a pipeline and become more and more deeply involved.
That sounds very similar to I think the young rap artist Meek Miles or something like that. That he had some offense that was. Pardon me?
I said exactly, Meek Mill, exactly.
Yes. So I understand that. Now, moving from that, I do want to ask you a little bit about the brain development and wondering what your experiences may be, and maybe some of our other participants might want to get in what they know about it. But I am wondering, as you talk about brain development for the adolescents, in the therapy or in the work that we do with adolescents, should it be advised to really talk about brain development with the young people, helping them to understand perhaps why their reactions are the way they are, particularly because we get a lot of "I don't know" responses from young people. And a lot of times they really may not know, but and perhaps with the understanding about brain development, we get to a place we can better understand why they respond or why they react to certain situations. What do you all think about the talking brain development to young people? Does that happen?
Hey, Emmett, this is Evan. I'm going to chime in here because this is really an interesting point. I think in general in the field, as a treatment person for all the years that I've been, I've always been find that there's a little bit of a disparity between what we know and what we bring to the table as professionals, and how willing we are to be collaborative with the young people or anyone that we're working with, to be transparent and let them in on what we're thinking about them. And I think I really like the idea of if there's a way of doing it without talking down the young people, to really share with them what we know as a way of humanizing and making the interaction with them more collaborative, saying, like, you know, I don't blame you. I know this is a time where your emotions are very volatile, and that's something I understand and I don't blame you for. If there's a way to work it into the script, so to speak, of how we talk to young people, I think that would be productive and respectful.
Thank you, Evan, for that. Anybody else have thoughts in that regard? I can offer that with my son many years ago. I talked to him about the hardening of the gray matter. He was having an issue with decision making, right? So we struggled with the decisions he was making for a while. And one day, out of my own frustration, I just told him, you know, they used to tell us when we were a kid we were hard-headed, but really we're not hard-headed, we're soft-headed. You know, so we talked about that and talked about the gray matter, and lo and behold, at about 26 or 27 years old in a discussion we was having, he said, "Hey, Dad, I think my gray matter is hardening up some." And, you know, so I really wonder about that.
Hey, this is Mitch Farron here. I'd concur with what's been shared and build on what Evan shared. I think providing information or facilitating access to helping people learn about themselves is always a good thing. The thing that I add to it is sort of the phrase that information in and of itself doesn't result in change. And I think that we do in adolescent and young adult services in particular sometimes see systems or providers or models where information is provided, but motivation isn't necessarily enhanced, or information isn't provided in developmentally or culturally accessible ways. And then we'll see systems be disappointed or get frustrated that change doesn't occur. So information is just one leg of this three-legged stool that we tend to look at. We want to look at motivation and readiness for change, and we also want to look at developmental capacity, how information is provided, how it's matched to a young person's skills and styles and culture and history and tradition, how it has a meaning and relevance for the individual. So information is an important part of the picture, but I think we fall down when we believe it's the entire picture, and I've seen that happen in systems.
Thank you, Mitch. I have a question for Tashira. You talk a lot about status offense and that system as potentially a particular risk factor for girls and girls of color. It is for everyone, obviously, but for girls of color particularly. And as a national policy person, I know there's been a lot of discussion recently about what is to become of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, the act that really created the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in Washington, our federal agency. that oversees work around status offense and juvenile justice, and some talk that it may be even at more risk than ever before of getting re-ratified and losing some of the protections, the minimal protections that are even in there. So I wonder if you could share with us what the thinking is for you policy folks on what the risks are going forward and what we're going to do about it as people working in the youth service fields.
Yeah, good question. So the bill was decades past due of being reauthorized, and despite having bipartisan support when it was first reintroduced in the most recently, it failed to pass both Congress and Senate, and it came through again, I believe, last year, and it did pass this time. And as I mentioned, it passed with amendments to that ballot court order exception that specifically is what allows for judges to place young people in locked facilities for status offenses. And so at this point, it has, from my understanding, a phase-out portion in the bill, meaning that over a period of years, states and jurisdictions will be expected to phase out their usage of the exception. But here's also where I think, Evan, policy and practice don't often align because you all have a relationship with NCJ, FCJ. I've heard from judges before that they had no idea what this legislation was and how it was intended to govern their behavior. And I think very often, if we are in more rural parts of the country, if we are in middle America, or places that don't have the connection to policy in the same way, that it's very easy for courtrooms, for prosecutors, probation officers, et cetera, to operate as isolated places that are not always being held to account to this larger federal legislation and protection. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the reauthorized bill actually changes behaviors. Right now, from my understanding, they're having lots of conversations, advocates are, about how to protect funding for the bill. It is passed, but we're concerned about certain portions of it being gutted.
Okay, thank you for that analysis.
And I want to go back, if you all don't mind, and say something about the conversation about adolescent brain development and how it affects decision-making. It's an analogy that I give very often. I don't know if you all are familiar with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, a pediatrician, I believe, on the West Coast. And all of her work around ACEs and trauma and toxic stress and how it affects young people's growth and development. But I heard her speak once at a conference, and she talked about how it took, I believe, 200 years from the point where doctors first began to suspect that germs were causing high rates of infections, and a way to be able to mitigate that or reduce that risk was to simply wash your hands. So 200 years from the time that a person said, I think we should wash our hands before going into surgery, to where it now is a mandated practice that's expected across the medical profession. She made that point to say, we don't have 200 years when thinking about the role of toxic stress and trauma on young people's development. And I would bring that to this conversation as well, that we are by and large the choir, but I often think, how can we push our message beyond the choir so that it doesn't take 200 years to do what now we know it's just simple common sense. We think, oh, yeah, I need to wash my hands, right? It's just intuitive, but that wasn't always the case. And we are in that moment as well with how adolescent development and that knowledge and science should be driving our policies, our practices, and our procedures.
I would add to that, Shira, that there's some pretty high-level pushback from government on how we use brain science to shape juvenile justice policy. And I think that we should kind of brace ourselves partly, but also take your advice and be very specific about what we mean when we talk about, the changes and how that affects the way we work with adolescents. I think there is a concern that's maybe typical of the prevailing government attitudes that things like this will make us softer on crime once again, or that we will, hold people less responsible and less culpable, and that we're simply using the brain science for that reason. I think that's obviously an extreme and an inaccurate position in terms of how smart policymakers and all of us who work on the ground have used this new information. But I think that we should think about, you know, the kind of pushback that I'm hearing coming from our capital.
That's a really good point. I actually wasn't as familiar with that from a juvenile justice perspective. I think child welfare still has a a long way to go, but at least for obvious reasons, because it's in the child protection system, they're more amenable to those conversations. But good to know that there's this disconnect.
Tashira, I do want to ask, I hate to put you on the spot, but you may be aware of programs, any programs that seem to be doing effective work with girls of color who are particularly challenged by our systems.
Yeah, and actually, that's a great question, so no worries whatsoever putting me on the spot. In this second brief, we highlight the work of PACE Center for Girls and their work to keep young people in school and connected to a healthy and whole educational environment. It's all girls, primarily girls of color, who have been deemed at risk of failure, dropping out, system involvement, and they are sent to PACE centers all over the state of Florida. I believe there are 12 or 15 PACE centers all over the state of Florida. And the kind of outcomes that they've had, they've been able to go through a pretty rigorous evaluation, are humongous. I think they're probably on their way of becoming an evidence-based or at the very least an evidence-supported program if they're not already there. So I think PACE, when we talk about educational outcomes and how we can use schools specifically as a way to disrupt this pipeline and to provide some real concrete support, is excellent. While I'm talking about schools, let me just say I think any partnership with schools I would largely support, given the fact that all young people under the age of 18 are expected to be in a school. And so how can we reimagine schools as a place to really get at some of our concerns through partnerships, whether it be through medical field, behavioral health, legal services, child welfare, et cetera. Second thing that comes to mind, or program that comes to mind, is a program that doesn't have as much national attention as PACE, but one that we are continue to be very highly impressed by, and that is Gwen's Girls. And they are a program operating in Allegheny County. In fact, the video that I want to show you all came from Gwen's Girls, girls who are involved in Gwen's Girls. And it is an after-school program, an out-of-school time program, and also they provide an independent living facility for pregnant and parenting girls. And they have shown high levels of effectiveness. They operate from a trauma-informed lens. Their ED is actually a nurse practitioner, a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and so she brings behavioral health, that lens, to the work. And what's also impressive about them is that they have operated as a community hub. They're bringing together stakeholders across all the different systems and agencies in Allegheny County to work on the needs of Black girls, because they found that Black girls specifically were coming into the child welfare system later in age and as a result of a parent-child conflict charge by and large. And they were coming in, they were being placed directly into group homes. And group homes, especially for Black youth, doubles their chances of being in a juvenile justice facility. So Gwen's Girls is at the center now, small nonprofit, of trying to find resources and to leverage their influence to do something about addressing the needs of Black girls in the city without system involvement.
Great. That is great insight. Appreciate that. So that's a Gwen's Girls. Is it G-W-E-N, Gwen?
Yep, G-W-E-N, Gwen's Girls.
Okay. And at PACE Center in Florida, you mentioned various sites. Is that funded by the state of Florida?
It is, and good point, Emma, and I should have added that caveat, because there are some people who are like, well, yeah, PACE is great, but PACE also has this excellent relationship with folks in Tallahassee and the state capitol, because by and large they are funded as a juvenile justice program by the state. And so that has a lot to do with their innovative work, although, again, there's a lesson learned to be learned there about how we leverage our partnerships in order to get some of this more innovative work done and think outside the box regarding funding streams, and really push our lawmakers to make some decisions in how they prioritize the needs of young people.
That is. That is great feedback. Folks, we are about 9 minutes at the hour, and we only have Tashira for just a couple of more minutes. I understood you were going to be in the airport someplace. Is that right?
Yes, we're headed to the airport in just a few minutes when we wrap up the call.
Okay. Any other questions that we might have for Tashira? Please, folks, let us hear them. In the meantime, Tashira, I really do thank you for joining us today. This information has been tremendous. I get a feeling that we'll have to plug back in some more with you. The data that you provided, the statistics, I'm really interested more in hearing more about them, where they were collected and things of that nature. So I am hopeful that we'll have another opportunity to get together. Do you have any parting words for us?
Absolutely. Thank you for this opportunity. You know, when we created Fight for Our Girls and we put it out there, we didn't know how the juvenile justice field would take it or look at it, given the fact that CSSP is not, by and large, an organization known for doing juvenile justice work. But we felt that this topic was so important that we could not just talk about child welfare without also including those juvenile justice outcomes. And so I'm so happy that you all found interest in the brief, in the social justice series, because that means that decision was the correct one. And again, our argument is always to look at young people as holistically as possible, that they do not live their lives in silos, therefore we cannot put them in silos. And this conversation today has been very encouraging for me as far as ways that systems can better collaborate, ways that we can talk across the aisle, or in some cases right around the corner, right across the hall, as far as where our offices are situated. And again, I hope to remain connected to you all because I see you all as folks who have the knowledge that we at CSSP are always trying to mine being a national policy organization.
Fantastic. This feels like a great beginning. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, Reclaiming Futures Families and Guests. I think we are at that point. Jim, are there any upcoming events or announcements that you need to provide for us at this time?
Yeah, I just wanted to let you all know that we are about to send out an email to all announcing the national conference, which will be held October 8th to the 10th at the Perry Lane Hotel in Savannah, Georgia. So look for an email about that very soon.
Great. Great. Got those days. Get them nailed down, everybody. Anything else from across the country?
I'll just chime in with a thank you to Tashira, and thanks everybody for joining in. I look forward to more work with you, Tashira.
Same here.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. You guys have a great rest of your week and a great month, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you, Emmett.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.